Chapter 1. When Mr. Hiram B. Otis, the United States minister, bought Canterville Chase, everyone told him that he was doing a great foolish thing, because the estate was haunted. Even Lord Canterville himself, as a man of the most scrupulous honesty, felt it his duty to tell Mr. Otis when they came to discuss the conditions. "We ourselves," said Lord Canterville, "have utterly resisted living in that place ever since my great-aunt, the Duchess of Bolton, fainted, from which she never fully recovered, in the fright she experienced when she felt that two skeleton hands rested on her shoulders, while she was getting dressed for dinner. I feel it my duty to tell you, Mr. Otis, that the ghost has been seen by various members of my family, who are now living, as well as by the rector of the parish, the Reverend Auguste Dampier, attaché to Oxford University. After the tragic accident that befell the Duchess, none of the maids wanted to stay at home, and Lady Canterville could no longer sleep because of the mysterious noises coming from the corridor and from the library. "Sir," replied the minister, "I will acquire the property and the ghost, under inventory. I come from a modern country, where we can have everything that money is capable of providing, and those young and clever young men of ours who travel from part to part of the old continent, who take your best actors, and their best prima donnas, I am sure that if there is still a real ghost in Europe they will come looking for it right away to place it in one of our public museums or to walk the roads like a phenomenon." "The ghost exists, I fear," said Lord Canterville, smiling, "although it may resist the offers of your intrepid businessmen. It has been known for more than 3 centuries. It dates precisely from 1574, and it never stops showing up when a death is about to occur in the family." "Bah! GPs do the same, Lord Canterville. My friend, a ghost cannot exist, and I do not believe that the laws of nature allow exceptions in favor of the English aristocracy." "You really are very natural in America," said Lord Canterville, not quite understanding Mr. Otis's last remark. "Now, if you like to have a ghost at home, all the better. Just remember that I warned you." A few weeks later the deal was closed, and at the end of the season the minister and his family set out for Canterville. Mrs. Otis, who, under the name of Miss Lucretia or Tappan, of 52 West Street, had been an illustrious New York beauty, was still a most handsome woman of average age, with fine eyes and a sharp profile. Superb. Many American ladies, when they leave their native country, put on the air of a person afflicted with a chronic disease, and think that this is one of the hallmarks of Europe, but Mrs. Otis never made that mistake. He had a magnificent nature and an extraordinary abundance of vitality. In fact, he was thoroughly English in many respects, and could have been fairly quoted to support the thesis that we have everything in common with America today, except language, of course. His eldest son, christened Washington by his parents, in a moment of patriotism that he never ceased to regret, was a fair-haired, rather fine-looking boy who had set himself up as a candidate for diplomacy, running a cotillion in the Newport Casino for 3 seasons in a row, and even in London he was considered an exceptional dancer. His only weaknesses were Gardenias and Homeland. Apart from this, he was perfectly sensible. Miss Virginia E. Otis was a little girl of 15, lithe and graceful as a fawn, with a pretty carefree air in her big blue eyes. She was a marvelous horsewoman, and once raced old Lord Bilton on her pony, twice round the park, beating him by a horse and a half, just in front of the statue of Achilles, which caused such delirious enthusiasm in the young Duke of Cheshire, who proposed to her on the spot, and her guardians had to send it off that same night to Elton, bathed in tears. After Virginia came 2 twins, commonly known as the Stars and Stripes, because they were always found wearing them. They were lovely children, and, with the minister, the only true Republicans in the family. As Canterville Chase is 7 miles from Ascot, the nearest station, Mr. Otis wired for him in an open carriage, and they set off in the greatest of mirth. It was a lovely night in July, when the air was scented with the scent of pine trees. From time to time a dove could be heard cooing in its sweetest voice, or glimpsed, amid the tangle and frou-frou of the ferns, the burnished gold breast of some pheasant. Light squirrels spied on them from the top of the beeches as they passed, rabbits ran like exhalations through the bushes or over the grassy ridges, raising their white tails. However, as soon as they entered the avenue de Canterville Chase, the sky was suddenly covered with clouds. A strange silence seemed to invade the whole atmosphere. A great flock of crows passed silently over their heads, and before they reached the house a few drops had already fallen. On the steps stood an old woman, neatly dressed in black silk, with a white cap and apron, to receive them. It was Mrs. Umney, the housekeeper whom Mrs. Otis, at Lady Canterville's urging, agreed to retain in her post. He bowed low to the family as they stepped ashore, and said, in a singular accent from the good old days, "I welcome you to Canterville Chase." They followed her through a beautiful Tudor hall to the library, a long spacious room that ended in a wide glass window. Tea was ready. Then, when they had changed out of their traveling clothes, they all sat down and looked about him, while Mrs. Umney went about. Suddenly, Mrs. Otis's gaze fell on a dark red stain. That was on the pavement, right next to the fireplace and, without realizing it. Of his words, he said to Mrs. Umney, "I see that they have spilled something in that place." "Yes, ma'am," answered Mrs. Umney in a low voice. "There has been blood spilled." "It's scary," exclaimed Mrs. Otis. "I don't want blood stains in a room. That must be removed immediately." The old woman smiled, and in the same low, mysterious voice answered, "It is the blood of Lady Eleanor de Canterville, who was killed on the spot by her own husband, Simon de Canterville, in 1565. Simon outlived her by 9 years, suddenly disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Her body was never found, but her guilty soul continues to haunt the house. The bloodstain has been greatly admired by tourists and other people, but removing it is impossible." "That's all nonsense," exclaimed Washington Otis. "Pinkerton's Champion brand detergent and stain remover will make that disappear in no time." And before the terrified housekeeper could intervene, she was on her knees and briskly rubbing the floorboards with a stick of a black cosmetic-like substance. Within moments the stain had disappeared without a trace. "I already knew that the Pinkerton Champion would erase it," he exclaimed in a triumphant tone, casting a circular gaze over his family, full of admiration. But scarcely had he uttered those words, when a tremendous flash of lightning lit up the gloomy room, and the crash of thunder aroused all but Mrs. Umney, who fainted. "What atrocious weather!" said the minister calmly, lighting a long cigarette lighter. "I think that the country of the grandparents is so full of people that there is not enough good weather for everyone. I have always thought that the best thing the English can do is emigrate." "Dear Hiram," replied Mrs. Otis, "what can we do with a woman who faints? We will deduct that from your salary in cash. That way you won't faint again." Indeed, Mrs. Umney did not take long to come to herself. She was, however, obviously deeply moved, and in a solemn voice warned Mrs. Otis that some trouble was to be expected in the house. "Gentlemen, I have seen with my own eyes some things that would make any Christian's hair stand on end. And during nights and nights I have not been able to close my eyes because of the terrible events that were happening. In spite of which, Mr. Otis and his wife earnestly assured the good woman that they were not afraid of any of the ghosts. The old housekeeper, after having implored the blessing of Providence on her new masters and arranged for an increase in her wages, limped off to her room. Chapter 2. The storm raged throughout the night, but produced nothing extraordinary. The next day, in the morning, when they went down to lunch, they found the terrible stain on the floor again. "I don't think the unrivaled cleaner is to blame," said Washington, "as I've tried it on all kinds of stains. It must be a ghost thing." Accordingly, he blotted out the stain, after rubbing a bit. The next day, in the morning, it had reappeared. And yet the library had been locked the night before, because Mr. Otis had taken the key upstairs. Since then, the family began to be interested in that. Mr. Otis was about to believe that he had been too dogmatic in denying the existence of ghosts. Mrs. Otis expressed her intention of joining the Psychical Society, and Washington prepared a long letter to Messrs. Myers and Podmone, based on the persistence of bloodstains when they arise from crime. That night dispelled all doubts about the objective existence of ghosts. The family had taken advantage of the cool of the afternoon to go for a drive. They returned at 9, having a light supper. The conversation did not fall for a moment on ghosts, so that even the most elementary conditions of waiting and receptivity that so often precede psychic phenomena were missing. The matters they discussed, from what I later learned from Mrs. Otis, were simply the usual conversations of educated Americans belonging to the upper classes, such as the vast superiority of Miss Janie Davenport over Sarah Bernhard, as an actress, the difficulty of finding green corn, buckwheat biscuits, even in the best English houses, the importance of Boston in the development of the universal soul, the advantages of the system that consists of noting the luggage of the travelers, and the sweetness of the New York accent, compared to the London accent. There was no question of the supernatural at all, there was not the slightest indirect allusion to Simon de Canterville. At 11, the family retired. At 12:30 all the lights were off. Shortly after, Mr. Otis was awakened by a strange noise in the corridor outside his room. It seemed like the noise of old iron, and it got closer and closer. He got up immediately, turned on the light and looked at the time. It was 1 o'clock. Mr. Otis was perfectly calm. He took his pulse and found nothing altered. The strange noise continued, at the same time that the sound of footsteps was clearly heard. Mr. Otis put on his slippers, took a long veil from his dresser, and opened the door. And he saw before him, in the pale moonlight, a terrible-looking old man. His eyes were like burning coals. Long gray hair fell in unruly locks to her shoulders. His clothes, old-fashioned in cut, were stained and tattered. From his wrists and ankles hung heavy chains and rusty shackles. "My distinguished sir," said Mr. Otis, "permit me to beg you earnestly to oil those chains. I have brought you a bottle of Tammany Greaser for this purpose. Sun Levant. They say that a single ointment is most effective, and on the label there are several certificates from our most illustrious native soothsayers, which attest to this. I am going to leave it here, next to the rocking chairs, and I will have a real pleasure in provide you with more, if you wish." Saying which, the Minister of the United States put the vial down on a marble table, closed the door, and went back to bed. The Canterville ghost remained immobile for some minutes with indignation. Then he flung the vial down on the waxed floor in rage and fled down the corridor, uttering cavernous growls and emitting a strange green light. However, as he reached the grand oak staircase, a door suddenly opened. Two childish figures appeared, dressed in white, and a voluminous pillow brushed against her head. Obviously there was no time to waste, so, using the fourth dimension of space as a means of escape, he vanished through the stucco, and the house regained its tranquility. Arriving at a secret room in the left wing, he leaned against a ray of moonlight to catch his breath, and began to reflect to realize his situation. Never in all his brilliant career, which had lasted for 300 consecutive years, was he so grossly insulted. She remembered the widowed duchess, in whom she provoked a crisis of terror, looking at herself in the mirror, covered in diamonds and lace, of the 4 maidens whom he had driven mad, into hysterical convulsions, just by making faces at them between the curtains of one of the guest rooms, of the rector of the parish, whose candle he blew out when the good gentleman returned from the library late at night, and who from then on became a martyr to all kinds of nervous disturbances, of old Madame de Tremouillac, who, waking up at midnight, saw him sitting in an armchair by the fire, in the form of a skeleton, preoccupied with reading the diary she kept of her life, and who, as a result of the impression, had to stay in bed for 6 months, victim of a brain attack. Once cured, she reconciled with the church and broke all relations with the noted skeptic, Monsieur de Voltaire. He also remembered the terrible night when Lord Canterville's scoundrel was found dying in his boudoir, with a jack of swords plunged into his throat, being forced to confess that by means of that letter he had swindled Carlos Foss out of £10,000. At Crookford's house. And he swore that the ghost made him swallow that letter. All his great deeds came back to him. He saw past the butler who had blown his brains out for seeing a green hand drumming on the panes, and the beautiful Lady Steelfield, condemned to wear a black velvet collar around her neck to hide the 5-finger mark, imprinted as a hot iron on his white skin, and who ended up drowning in the nursery that was at the end of Avenida Real. And, full of the egotistical enthusiasm of the true artist, he reviewed his most famous creations. He gave himself a bitter smile when he recalled his last appearance in the role of Reuben the Red, or the Strangled Baby, his debut in Jabin, the skinny vampire of Beverley Moor, and the furor he caused a lovely June afternoon just bowling with your own bones on the lawn tennis field. And all for what? So that some miserable Americans would offer him the Solvent brand greaser and throw pillows at his head. It was really intolerable. Furthermore, history teaches us that no ghost was ever treated in that way. Came to the conclusion of that it was necessary to take revenge, and he remained until dawn in an attitude of deep meditation. Chapter 3. When the Otis family gathered for lunch the next morning, the ghost was discussed at length. The United States minister was naturally a little miffed that his offer had not been accepted. "I would not in any way wish to injure the ghost personally," he said, "and I admit that, given the length of his stay in the house, it was not polite to throw a pillow over his head." I'm sorry to say that this very fair remark caused an explosion of laughter from the twins. "But, on the other hand," continued Mr. Otis, "if he insists, without further ado, not to use the Solvent brand lubricator, we will see ourselves forced to remove his chains. There would be no way to sleep with all that noise outside the bedroom doors." But, nevertheless, in the rest of the week they were not disturbed. The only thing that caught their attention was the continuous reappearance of the bloodstain on the parquet of the library. It was really very strange, the more so since Mr. Otis locked the door at night, just like the windows. The color changes that the spot underwent, comparable to those of a chameleon, also produced frequent comments in the family. One morning it was dark red, almost purplish, other times it was vermilion, then a splendid purple, and one day when they came down to pray, according to the simple rites of the Free Reformed Episcopal Church of America, they found it a beautiful emerald green. Naturally, these kaleidoscopic changes greatly amused the gathering, and bets were placed every night in complete tranquility. The only person who did not take part in the prank was young Virginia. For unknown reasons, she was always shocked by the bloodstain, and she was about to cry the morning it appeared emerald green. The ghost made its second appearance on Sunday night. Shortly after they were all in bed, they were alarmed by a huge crash that was heard in the living room. They hurried downstairs, only to find that a full suit of armor had fallen from its support and fallen onto the flagstones. Nearby, seated in a high-backed chair, the Canterville ghost rubbed his knees, a look of sharp pain on his face. The twins, who had provided themselves with their slingshots, immediately launched 2 pellets at him, with that certainty of aim that is only acquired by dint of long and patient exercises on the calligraphy teacher. Meanwhile, the minister of the United States kept the ghost under threat from his revolver, and, in accordance with Californian etiquette, urged him to raise his arms. The ghost sprang up with a cry of savage rage, and vanished out of their midst like a mist, extinguishing Washington Otis's candle as it went, and leaving them all in utter darkness. When he reached the top of the stairs, once in control of himself, he decided to launch his famous peal of satanic laughter, which on more than one occasion had been very useful to him. People said that this made Lord Rakers to pay Gray in a single night. And that 3 successive mistresses of government resigned before finishing their first month in office. Accordingly, he uttered his most horrible laugh, gradually awakening the echoes in the ancient vaults, but when these were turned off, the door opened and Mrs. Otis appeared, dressed in pale blue. "I'm afraid," said the lady, "that you are unwell, and here is a vial of Dr. Dobell's tincture. If it's indigestion, this will do you good." The ghost looked at her with flaming eyes of fury and believed it was his duty to metamorphose into a great black dog. It was a trick that had given him a well-deserved reputation, and to which he attributed the incurable idiocy of Lord Canterville's uncle, the Honourable Thomas Horton. But a sound of approaching footsteps made him waver in his cruel determination, and he contented himself with turning a little phosphorescent. He immediately vanished, after uttering a sepulchral groan, because the twins were about to catch up with him. Once in his room he felt devastated, seized with the most violent agitation. The coarseness of the twins, the gross materialism of Mrs. Otis, all this was really vexatious, but what humiliated him most was that he no longer had the strength to wear armor. He counted on making an impression even on these modern Americans, on making them shudder at the sight of an armored specter, if not for reasonable reasons, at least out of deference to their national poet Longfellow, whose delicate and compelling poetry had often aided him. To kill time while the Cantervilles were in London. Furthermore, it was his own armor. He successfully took it to the Kenilworth tournament, being warmly congratulated by the Virgin Queen herself. But when he tried to put it on, he was completely crushed by the weight of the enormous breastplate and steel helmet. And he collapsed heavily on the stone flags, skinning his knees and bruising his right wrist. For several days he was very ill and could not leave his home more than necessary to keep the bloodstain in good condition. Notwithstanding which, by force of care he ended up recovering and decided to make a third attempt to terrorize the United States minister and his family. He chose for his reappearance on stage on Friday, August 17th, dedicating a large part of the day to reviewing his costumes. His choice finally fell on a hat with a brim raised on one side and falling on the other, with a red feather, in a shroud frayed at the sleeves and neck, and lastly in a rusty dagger. At sunset a great storm blew up. The wind was so strong that it shook and violently closed the doors and windows of the old house. That really was the time that suited him. Here is what he planned to do. He would stealthily go to Washington Otis's room, mutter some unintelligible phrases to him, staying at the foot of the bed, and plunge the dagger into his throat 3 times in succession, to the sounds of muffled music. He hated Washington above all, for he knew full well that it was he who used to remove the famous Canterville bloodstain, using Pinkerton's incomparable cleaner. After subduing the reckless, carefree young man, he would enter the room occupied by the United States minister and his wife. Once there, he would place a slimy hand on Mrs. Otis's forehead, and at the same time he would murmur, in a muffled voice, in the ear of the trembling minister, the terrible secrets of the charnel house. As for little Virginia, she still hadn't decided anything. I had never insulted him. She was pretty and loving. A few muffled grunts, coming out of the closet, seemed more than enough, and if they weren't enough to wake her, she would even throw it away. From the tip of his nose with his fingers stiff with paralysis. He was determined to teach the twins a lesson. The first thing he would do would be to sit on their breasts, in order to give them the sensation of a nightmare. Then, taking advantage of the fact that their beds were so close together, he would rise in the free space between them, looking like an ice-cold green corpse, until they stood paralyzed with terror. Immediately, abruptly throwing off his shroud, he would go around the bedroom on all fours, like a skeleton bleached by time, his eyes moving from their sockets, in his creation of Daniel the Mute, or the Suicide Skeleton, paper in which made a great effect on several occasions. He thought he was as good in this as in his other role of Martin L. Dement or the Masked Mystery. At 10:30 he heard the family go up to bed. For a few moments he was disturbed by the tumultuous laughter of the twins, who were obviously amused, with their crazy schoolboy joy, before going to bed. But at 11:15 all was quiet again, and when 12 struck he set out. The owl crashed against the window panes. The raven cressitated in the hollow of a 100-year-old yew tree, and the wind moaned wandering around the house, like a soul in pain. But the Otis family slept, not suspecting the fate that awaited them. He could clearly hear the regular snoring of the United States minister, overriding the noise of the rain and storm. It slipped stealthily across the stucco. A wicked smile played over his cruel, wrinkled mouth, and the moon hid his face behind a cloud as he passed the great pointed window, above which were depicted, in blue and gold, his own arms and those of his murdered wife. He kept on walking always, gliding like a fatal shadow, which seemed to make the very darkness recede in fear in his path. At one point he thought he heard someone calling him. He stopped, but it was only a dog, barking at Red Farm. He marched on, muttering strange 16th-century oaths, brandishing now and then the rusty dagger in the midnight air. At last he reached the corner of the corridor that led to Washington's room. There he made a brief stop. The wind tossed around her head her long gray locks and wrapped in grotesque and fantastic folds the unspeakable horror of the funereal shroud. Then the quarter sounded on the clock. He understood that the time had come. He gave himself a laugh and turned the corner. But no sooner had he done so than he backed away, uttering a plaintive wail of terror and hiding his livid face in his long bony hands. Before him was a hideous spectre, motionless as a statue, monstrous as a madman's nightmare. The wraith's head was bald and shiny, its face, round, fleshy and white. A hideous laugh seemed to twist his features into an eternal grimace. Crimson light streamed from the eyes, the mouth looked like a wide pit of fire, and a horrible garment, like his own, like Simon's himself, wrapped its silent snow around that gigantic form. On his chest was hung a sign with an inscription in strange and ancient characters. Perhaps it was an infamous sign, where terrible crimes were written, a terrible list of crimes. Lastly, he held in his right hand a gleaming steel scimitar. Having never seen ghosts before, he naturally felt a terrible panic, and, after hastily casting a second glance at the hideous monster, he returned to his room, stumbling into the shroud that was wrapped around him. He ran across the gallery, eventually dropping the rusty dagger into the minister's riding boots, where the steward found it the next day. Once sheltered in his retirement, he collapsed onto a small bunk bed, pulling the sheets over his head. But after a moment the indomitable courage of the old Cantervilles awoke in him, and he made up his mind to speak to the other ghost at daybreak. Accordingly, no sooner had dawn silvered the hills than he returned to the place where he had first seen the hideous ghost. He thought that, after all, two ghosts were worth more than one, and that with the help of his new friend he would be able to contend victoriously with the twins. But when he arrived at the site he found himself in the presence of a terrible spectacle. Something was undoubtedly wrong with the wraith, for the light had completely disappeared from its orbits. The flashing scimitar had fallen from his hand and he was leaning against the wall in a forced and uncomfortable attitude. Simon rushed forward and caught him in his arms, but how terrified he was when he saw the head detach and roll on the floor, while the body assumed the supine position, and he noticed that it was embracing a white thick canvas curtain and that a broom, a kitchen machete, and a pumpkin lay at its feet. Empty. Unable to comprehend this curious transformation, he seized the poster with a feverish hand, reading in the grey light of morning these terrible words. Behold the ghost Otis. The only true and authentic spirit. Beware of imitations. All the rest are fakes. And the whole truth appeared to him like lightning. He had been outwitted, cheated, tricked. The characteristic Canterville expression reappeared in his eyes. He clenched his toothless jaws and, raising his yellow hands above his head, swore, according to the picturesque ritual of the old school, that when the rooster blows twice the horn of his joyful call would consummate bloody deeds, and crime, quietly, would come out of his retirement. He had not finished formulating this terrible oath, when a rooster crowed from a distant farmhouse with a red brick roof. He laughed a long, slow, bitter laugh, and waited. He waited an hour, and then another, but for some mysterious reason the rooster did not crow again. Finally, at about 7:30, the arrival of the maids forced him to abandon his terrible guard and he returned to his dwelling, with a haughty step, thinking of his vain oath and his vain failed project. Once there, he consulted several books on chivalry, the reading of which interested him extraordinarily, and he was able to verify that the rooster always crowed twice on every occasion that oath was used. "May the devil take that volatile animal," he murmured. "In another time I would have fallen on him with my good spear, piercing his neck and making him sing for me again, even if he burst." And saying this, he retired to his comfortable lead box, and there he remained until nightfall. Chapter 4. The next day the ghost felt very weak and tired. The terrible emotions of the last 4 weeks were beginning to take their toll. His nervous system was completely upset, and he trembled at the slightest noise. He did not leave his room for 5 days, and ended up making a concession regarding the bloodstain on the parquet in the library. Since the Otis family didn't want to see her, she certainly didn't deserve her. Those people were visibly placed on a lower plane of material life and were incapable of appreciating the symbolic value of sensible phenomena. The question of the apparitions of ghosts and the development of the astral bodies was really something unknown to them and indisputably beyond their reach. But, at least, it was an inescapable duty for him to show up in the corridor once a week and babble out the large lancet window on the first and third Wednesday of each month. He saw no worthy means of escaping from that obligation. It is true that his life was very criminal, but apart from that, he was a very conscientious man in all that had to do with the supernatural. Thus, the 3 following Saturdays, as usual, he crossed the corridor between 12 at night and 3 in the morning, taking all possible precautions so as not to be seen or heard. He took off his boots, stepped as lightly as possible on the old rotten timbers, wrapped himself in a large black velvet cloak, and kept using the Solvent greaser for his chains. I am forced to admit that it was only after much hesitation that he decided to adopt this last means of protection. But at last, one night, while the family was eating dinner, he slipped into Mrs. Otis's bedroom and took the vial with him. At first he felt a little humiliated, but later he was reasonable enough to understand that this invention deserved great praise and contributed, in a certain way, to the realization of his projects. Despite everything, he was not without problems. They never failed to string him up and down the corridor to make him stumble in the dark, and once he had disguised himself for the part of Black Isaac, or the hunter of Hogsley Wood, he fell full length when he put the eyes stood on a track of soapy boards that the twins had laid from the threshold of the tapestry room to the top of the oak staircase. This last affront infuriated him so much that he decided to make an effort to impose his dignity and consolidate his social position, and he formed the project of visiting the insolent boys of Eton the following night, in his famous role of Rupert the Bold or the Headless Count. He had not shown himself in that guise for 60 years, that is, since he so terrified the fair Lady Barbara Modish that she withdrew her consent to the grandfather of the present Lord Canterville and eloped to Gretna Green with the arrogant Jack Castletown, swearing that for nothing in the world would he consent to become related to a family that tolerated the walks of such a horrible ghost on the terrace at sunset. Poor Jack was soon slain in a duel by Lord Canterville on Wandsworth Meadow, and Lady Barbara died of grief at Tunbridge Wells before the year was out, so it was a great success by all accounts. Without, however, it was, allowing me to use a theatrical slang term to apply it to one of the greatest mysteries of the supernatural world, or in more scientific language, of the world superior to nature. It was, I repeat, a creation of the most difficult, and it took her 3 good hours to finish the preparations. Finally, everything was ready, and he was very happy with his disguise. The large riding boots, which matched the suit, were a little baggy for him, though, and he could find only one of the 2 horse pistols, but, in general, he was very satisfied, and at 1:15 he passed through the stucco and down the corridor. When he was near the room occupied by the twins, which I will call the blue bedroom, because of the color of its curtains, he found the door ajar. In order to make a sensational entrance, he pushed her violently, but a jug of water came crashing down on him, drenching him to the bone, missing his shoulder by inches. At the same time he heard muffled laughter from the double 4-poster bed. His nervous system suffered such a shock that he rushed back to his rooms, and the next day he had to lie in bed with severe rheumatism. The only consolation he had was not having carried his head on his shoulders, because without this the consequences could have been more serious. From then on, he gave up forever scaring away that strong family of Americans, and limited himself to wandering down the corridor, wearing selvage slippers, wrapped around his neck in a thick scarf, for fear of drafts, and armed with a small arquebus, in case he was attacked by the twins. It was around September 19th that he received the coup de grace. He had gone downstairs to the spacious drawing room, certain that in this place at least he was safe from tricks, and amused himself by making satirical remarks about the large photographs of the United States minister and his wife, taken at home. Of Thoreau. He was dressed simply but decently, in a long shroud flecked with graveyard mold. He had tied his jaw with a strip of cloth and was carrying a small lantern and a gravedigger's mattock. In a word, he was disguised as Jonah the Digger, or the body snatcher of Chirsty Barn. It was one of his most notable creations and one of those that the Cantervilles kept in memory, with more reason, since it was the real cause of his quarrel with Lord Rufford, his neighbour. It was about 2:15 in the morning, and, in his opinion, no one was moving in the house. But as he was walking calmly in the direction of the library, to see what was left of the bloodstain, two figures rushed towards him from a shadowy corner, waving their arms madly above their heads, as they cried in his ear, "Boo!" In a panic, which was quite natural under the circumstances, he rushed for the stairs, only to find himself facing Washington Otis, who was waiting for him armed with the garden watering can, in such a way that, surrounded by his enemies, almost cornered, he had to evaporate in the great cast-iron stove, which, fortunately for him, was not lit, and make his way to his rooms through pipes and chimneys, reaching his refuge in the terrible state in which the agitation, the soot and the despair put him. Since that night he was never seen again on a nocturnal expedition. The twins lay in wait many times to surprise him, sowing the corridors with walnut shells every night, much to the annoyance of their parents and servants. But it was useless. His self-esteem was deeply hurt, no doubt, and he didn't want to show it. In view of this, Mr. Otis set to work on his great work. On the history of the Democratic Party, a work that had begun 3 years earlier. Mrs. Otis organized an extraordinary clam bake, which was talked about throughout the country. The children devoted themselves to playing bar, écarté, poker and other national amusements of the United States. Virginia took horseback rides along the roads, in the company of the little Duke of Cheshire, who was in Canterville for his last week of vacation. Everyone supposed that the ghost had disappeared, to the point that Mr. Otis wrote a letter to Lord Canterville to inform him, and received another letter in reply in which the latter expressed his pleasure at the news and sent his most sincere congratulations to the worthy wife of the minister. But the Otises were wrong. The ghost was still in the house, and although he was very delicate, he was not about to retire, especially after learning that among the guests was the little Duke of Cheshire, whose uncle, Lord Francis Stilton, had once wagered with Colonel Carberry that he would play dice with the Canterville ghost. The next morning Lord Stilton was found stretched out on the floor of the gambling hall in such a paralyzed state that, despite his advanced age, he could never utter more words than these. 666. This story was once well known, though, in the sentiments of two noble families, every effort was made to conceal it, and there is a detailed account of all of it in the 3rd volume of Lord Tattle's Memoirs. About the Prince Regent and his friends. Since then, the ghost had been anxious to prove that he had not lost his influence over the Stiltons, to whom he was also related by marriage, since a cousin of his married secondly to Mr. Bulkeley, from whom they are descended in a direct line, like everyone else. The world knows, the Dukes of Cheshire. Accordingly, he made preparations to show himself to Virginia's little lover in his famous role of Vampire Friar, or the Bled Benedictine. It was a dreadful sight, that when old Lady Starberry saw it performed, that is to say, on New Year's Eve, 1764, she began to utter high-pitched shrieks, which resulted in a mighty stroke of apoplexy, and her death within 3 days, not before first disinheriting the Cantervilles and leaving all their money to his pharmacist in London. But at the last moment his terror of the twins kept him in his room, and the little Duke slept peacefully in the great canopied bed crowned with feathers in the royal bedchamber, dreaming of Virginia. Chapter 5. Virginia and her curly-haired adorer rode a few days later through the Brockley meadows, in which she tore her horsewoman's dress jumping over a hedge, so that, on her way home, she entered down the back stairs so they wouldn't see her. As she ran past the door to the tapestry room, which stood wide open, she thought she saw someone inside. He thought it was his mother's maid, who often went to work in that room. She stuck her head in to ask him to sew her dress. But, to his surprise, it was the Canterville ghost himself who was there. She had settled in front of the window, looking at the flaming gold of the yellow trees that fluttered through the air, the red leaves that danced madly along the great avenue. His head was resting on one hand, and his whole attitude revealed the deepest despondency. In truth, he looked so overwhelmed, so dejected, that little Virginia, instead of giving in to her first impulse, which was to run and lock herself in her room, felt full of compassion and decided to go and comfort him. The girl had such a light step and he had such a deep melancholy that he did not realize her presence until he spoke to her. "I've been sorry for you," he said, "but my brothers are going back to Eton tomorrow, and then, if you behave yourself, no one will torment you." "It's inconceivable to ask me to behave myself," he replied, staring in astonishment at the young lady who had the audacity to speak to him. "Perfectly inconceivable. It is necessary for me to shake my chains, to growl through the keyholes, and to run about at night. Is that what you call misbehaving? I have no other reason for being." "That is not a reason for being. In your time you were very bad, you know. Mrs. Umney told us the day we arrived that you killed your wife." "Yes, I admit it," replied the ghost incautiously. "But it was a family affair and no one had to interfere." "It's very wrong to kill anybody," said Virginia, sometimes assuming a pretty puritanical gravity, perhaps inherited from some New England ancestor. "Oh, I cannot suffer the cheap severity of abstract morality. My wife was ugly. I never starched my cuffs enough and I didn't know anything about cooking. Look, I had shot a superb deer one day in the Hogsley Woods, a handsome 2-year-old buck. Well, you can't imagine how he served it to me. But anyway, let's leave that. It's settled, and I don't find it right that her brothers let me starve, even if I killed her. Let them starve him to death. Oh, Mr. Ghost. Don Simone, are you hungry? There's a sandwich in my sewing box. He would like. No, thanks, now I no longer eat, but, all the same, I find it very kind of you. You are much more attentive than the rest of your horrible, surly, coarse, thieving family." "Enough!" cried Virginia, stamping her foot on the ground. "The surly, the horrible and the ordinary are you. As for the thief, you know that he stole my colors from the paint box to restore that ridiculous bloodstain in the library. You started by taking all my reds, even the vermilion, making it impossible for me to paint sunsets. Then you grabbed emerald green and chrome yellow. And, finally, I only have indigo and white left. So now I can only do moonlight, which is horrible to see, and also very uncomfortable to color. And I haven't accused him, even though I'm annoyed and even though all of that stuff is completely ridiculous. Has emerald green blood ever been seen? Let's see, said the ghost, with a certain sweetness, and what was I going to do? It's very difficult these days to get real blood, and since your brother started with his incomparable stain remover, I don't see why I wouldn't use your colors to resist. As for the tone, it is a matter of taste. Thus, for example, the Cantervilles have blue blood, the bluest blood that exists in England. Although I know that you Americans do not pay the slightest attention to those things. You don't know anything, and the best thing you can do is emigrate, and that way you'll get an idea of something. My father will be happy to provide you with free passage, and although there are heavy taxes on spirits, they will not give you any trouble at customs. And once in New York, you can count on great success. I know countless people who would give $100,000 to have ancestors and would sacrifice even more to have a ghost for the family. I don't think I would have much fun in the United States. Maybe it's because we don't have any ruins or curiosities there, Virginia said mockingly. What curiosities or what ruins? Answered the ghost. You have your navy and your manners. Good night, I'm going to ask Dad to give the twins one more week of vacation. Don't go, Miss Virginia, I beg you, exclaimed the ghost. I'm so lonely and I'm so miserable, I don't know what to do. I would like to go to bed and I can't. Well, it's inconceivable, all you have to do is get into bed and turn off the light. Sometimes it is very difficult to stay awake, especially in a church, but, on the other hand, sleeping is very easy. You see, the twins know how to sleep admirably, and they are not the smartest. I haven't slept for 300 years, said the old man sadly, making Virginia's beautiful blue eyes wide in wonder. I haven't slept in 300 years, so I feel very tired. Virginia assumed a grave manner, and her thin lips moved like rose petals. He walked over and knelt beside the ghost, staring at its old, wrinkled face. Poor little ghost, he uttered in a low voice, and isn't there anywhere you can sleep? Far away, past the pine forest, he answered in a low, dreamy voice, there's a little garden. The grass grows on it tall and thick, there the great white stars of the hemlock can be seen, there the nightingale sings all night. Sing all night, and the frozen crystal moon drops her gaze and the yew extends its giant arms over the sleepers. Virginia's eyes misted with tears and she buried her face in her hands. You mean the garden of death, he murmured. Yes, of death. It must be beautiful. Rest on the soft dark earth, while the grasses sway above our heads, and listen to the silence. Having neither yesterday nor tomorrow. Forget about time and life, dwell in peace. Can you help me? You can open wide the doors of death for me, because love accompanies you always, and love is stronger than death. Virginia trembled. An icy shudder ran through his entire being, and for a few moments there was a great silence. It seemed to him that he was living a terrible dream. Then the ghost spoke again in a voice that resounded like the sighs of the wind. Have you ever read the old prophecy on the stained glass windows in the library? Oh, many times, exclaimed the girl, raising her eyes. I know her very well. It is painted in curious gold letters and is difficult to read. It has no more than these 6 verses. When a young blonde manages to sprout. A prayer from the sinner's lips. When the barren almond tree bears fruit. and a girl let her tears flow. Then the whole house will be quiet again, and peace will return to Canterville. But I don't know what they mean. They mean that you have to cry with me for my sins, because I have no tears, and that you have to pray with me for my soul, because I have no faith, and then, if you have always been sweet, good, and affectionate, the angel of death will seize me. Will see terrible beings in the darkness, and fatal voices will murmur in your ears, but they will not be able to do you any harm, because infernal powers cannot do anything against the purity of a girl. Virginia did not answer, and the ghost wrung its hands in the violence of despair, never taking its gaze from the bowed blonde head. Suddenly the young woman stood up, very pale, with a gleam in her eyes. "I'm not afraid," he said with a firm voice, "and I'll beg the angel to have mercy on you." The ghost rose from her seat with a weak cry of joy, took the blonde head in her hands, with a gentleness reminiscent of times gone by, and kissed her. Her fingers were cold as ice and her lips hot as fire, but Virginia did not falter. The ghost led her through the gloomy room. On a dull green tapestry were embroidered little hunters. They blew into their fringed horns, and with their pretty hands they made gestures that "Back off. Retrace your steps, Virginia. Go, go," they shouted. But the ghost was squeezing her hand more tightly at that moment, and she closed her eyes so as not to see them. Horrible animals with lizard tails and big bulging eyes blinked mischievously in the corners of the fireplace, as they whispered to him, "Be careful, Virginia, be careful. We may never see you again." But the ghost quickened its pace, and Virginia heard nothing. When they reached the end of the room, the old man stopped, muttering some words that she did not understand. Virginia opened her eyes again and saw the wall slowly dissipate, like a mist, and a black cavern open before her. A harsh and icy wind whipped them, the girl feeling that her dress was being pulled. "Hurry, hurry," cried the ghost, "or it will be too late." And at the same moment the wall closed behind them again and the tapestry room was deserted. Chapter 6. About 10 minutes later the tea bell rang and Virginia did not come downstairs. Mrs. Otis sent one of the servants to fetch her. He was not long in coming back, saying that he had not been able to discover Miss Virginia anywhere. As the girl was in the habit of going to the garden every afternoon to pick flowers for dinner, Mrs. Otis was not in the least disturbed. But 6 o'clock rang and Virginia did not appear. Then his mother became seriously uneasy and sent her children to look for him, while she and her husband went through all the rooms of the house. At 6:30 the twins returned, saying that they had found no trace of their sister anywhere. Then they were all extremely moved, and no one knew what to do, when Mr. Otis suddenly remembered that a few days before a tribe of gypsies had been allowed to camp in the park. So he set out immediately for Blackfell Hollow, accompanied by his eldest son and 2 of his farm servants. The little Duke of Cheshire, completely mad with anxiety, begged Mr. Otis insistently to let him accompany him, but he refused, fearing some trouble. But when he arrived at the site in question, he saw that the gypsies had left. They hurried to flee, no doubt about it, for the fire was still burning and there were plates on the grass. After sending Washington and the 2 men to search the surroundings, he hurried back and sent telegrams to all the police inspectors in the county, begging them to look for a young woman kidnapped by some tramps or gypsies. Then he had his horse brought to him, and after insisting that his wife and 3 children be seated at table, he set off with a servant down the road to Ascot. He had barely gone 2 miles when he heard a gallop behind him. He turned, seeing the little Duke arriving on his little horse, his face flushed and his head uncovered. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Otis," the young man gasped, "but it's impossible for me to eat while Virginia doesn't show up. I beg you, don't be angry with me. If he had allowed us to get married last year, this would never have happened. You don't reject me, do you?" "I can't, and I don't want to leave." The minister could not help but smile at that handsome and reckless young man, deeply moved by the devotion he showed for Virginia. Leaning over his horse, he patted her shoulders kindly, and said, "Well, Cecil, since you insist on coming, I have no choice but to admit you to my company, but mind you, I have to buy him a hat at Ascot." "Damn hats! What I want is Virginia," exclaimed the little Duke, laughing. And immediately afterwards they galloped to the station. Once there, Mr. Otis asked the boss if they had not seen a young woman whose address corresponded to Virginia on the departure platform, but found nothing about her. Notwithstanding which, the station master sent telegrams to the stations of the route, ascending and descending, and promised to exercise a minute watch. Presently, after buying a hat for the little Duke at a novelty store that was closing up, Mr. Otis rode to Bexley, a town 4 miles beyond, and which, according to they told him, it was very frequented by gypsies. They made the country guard get up, but they couldn't get any information from him. So it was that, after crossing the square, the 2 horsemen took the road home again, reaching Canterville about 11 o'clock, exhausted and their hearts torn with anxiety. There they met Washington and the twins, waiting for them at the door with lanterns, because the avenue was very dark. Not the slightest sign of Virginia had been discovered. The gypsies were shot in Brockley Meadow, but the girl was not among them. They explained the haste of their departure by saying that they had mistaken the day on which the Chorton Fair was to be held, and that fear of being too late compelled them to hurry. Also, they seemed heartbroken by Virginia's disappearance, for they were so grateful to Mr. Otis for allowing them to camp in his park. 4 of them stayed behind to take part in the inquiries. The carp pond was emptied. They searched the farm in every way but got nothing. It was evident that Virginia was lost, at least for that night, and it was with an air of deep despondency that Mr. Otis and the young men entered the house, followed by the servant, who was leading the horse and the little horse by the bridle. In the hall they met the group of servants, full of terror. Poor Mrs. Otis was lying on a sofa in the library, almost mad with fear and anxiety, and the old housekeeper was moistening her forehead with eau de cologne. It was a sad meal. They barely spoke, and even the twins themselves seemed terrified and dismayed, because they loved their sister very much. When they had finished, Mr. Otis, in spite of the little Duke's entreaties, bade everyone go to bed, as there was nothing he could do that night. Tomorrow he would wire Scotland Yard to have several detectives immediately at his disposal. But lo and behold, just as they were leaving the dining room, the tower clock struck 12. Hardly had the vibrations of the last stroke died away, when a crack was heard accompanied by a piercing scream. A tremendous clap of thunder shook the house, a melody, which had nothing earthly about it, floated in the air. A canvas from the wall suddenly came unstuck at the top of the stairs, and on the landing, very pale, almost white, Virginia appeared, carrying a small casket in her hand. They immediately rushed towards her. Mrs. Otis held her passionately to her heart. The little Duke almost choked her with the violence of his kisses, and the twins performed a wild war dance around the group. "Oh, my daughter! Where have you been?" said Mr. Otis, rather crossly, thinking that he had meant to play a trick on all of them. Cecil and I have searched the whole country for you, and your mother nearly died of fright. Don't ever give pranks like that to anyone again. Lest the ghost, cried the twins, continuing their capering. My dear daughter, thank God that we have found you, we will never be apart again, murmured Mrs. Otis, kissing the girl, all trembling, and caressing her golden hair, which spilled over her shoulders. Dad, Virginia said softly, I was with the ghost. He's already dead. You need to go see it. It was very bad, but he sincerely regretted everything he had done, and before he died he gave me this little box of beautiful jewels. The whole family looked at her mute and terrified, but she had a very solemn and very serious air. Then, turning around, he led them through the gap in the wall and down a secret corridor. Washington followed them carrying a candle lit, which he took from the table. At last they came to a great oak door bristling with stout nails. Virginia touched it, and then the door swung on its enormous hinges, and they found themselves in a low, narrow room with a vaulted ceiling, and one small window. Next to a large iron ring embedded in the wall, with which he was chained, a long skeleton was seen, stretched out full length on the flagstones. It seemed to stretch out its gaunt fingers, as if trying to reach a plate and a jug, of ancient form, placed in such a way that it could not reach them. The pitcher had undoubtedly been full of water, for its interior was lined with green mold. There was nothing left on the plate but a heap of dust. Virginia knelt by the skeleton, and, clasping her little hands, began to pray in silence, while the family gazed in amazement at the horrible tragedy whose secret had just been revealed. Poke! Suddenly exclaimed one of the twins, who had gone to look through the little window, trying to guess which side of the building the room fell on. Poke! The old almond tree, which was dry, has flourished. The leaves are admirably seen in the moonlight. God has forgiven him, said Virginia gravely, getting up. And a magnificent radiance seemed to illuminate his face. You're an angel, exclaimed the little Duke, encircling her neck with his arms and kissing her. Chapter 7. For days after these curious events, at about 11 o'clock at night, a funeral procession left Canterville House. The chariot was drawn by 8 black horses, each of which had a great plume of ostrich feathers on its head, which swayed. The leaden box was covered with a rich purple cloth, on which the arms of the Cantervilles were embroidered in gold. On either side of the wagon and carriages marched servants carrying lighted torches. The entire procession looked grand and impressive. Lord Canterville was presiding over the duel. She had come from Wales expressly to attend the funeral, and she was in the first car with little Virginia. Then came the Minister of the United States and his wife, and behind, Washington and the 2 boys. In the last carriage was Mrs. Umney. Everyone agreed that after being terrified of the ghost for more than 50 years, she really had a right to see it disappear forever. They dug a deep grave in a corner of the cemetery, precisely under the 100-year-old yew, and the last prayers were said, most pathetically, by the Reverend Auguste Dampier. Then, as the box was lowered into the pit, Virginia stepped forward, placing on top of it a large cross made of red and white almond blossoms. At that moment the moon came out from behind a cloud and flooded the churchyard with its silent billows of silver, and from a nearby grove rose the song of a nightingale. Virginia remembered the description given to her by the ghost of the Garden of Death. Her eyes filled with tears and she hardly uttered a word during the return. The next morning, before Lord Canterville left for town, Mrs. Otis conferred with him about the jewels given to Virginia by the ghost. They were superb, magnificent. There was, above all, a necklace of rubies, in an old Venetian setting, which was a splendid work of the 16th century, and the whole represented such a quantity that Mr. Otis felt very scrupulous about allowing his daughter to keep them. "Sir," said the minister, "I know that in this country the dead hand is applied to small objects as well as to land, and it is evident, very evident to me, that these jewels should remain in your possession as a family legacy. I beg you, therefore, to consent to taking them to London, regarding them simply as a part of your inheritance, restored to you in extraordinary circumstances. As for my daughter, she is but a child, and to this day, I am pleased to say, takes little interest in these trifles of superfluous luxury. I have also learned from Mrs. Otis, whose authority is not insignificant in matters of art, by the way, for she has been fortunate enough to spend several winters in Boston as a girl, that these precious stones are of great monetary value, and that if they were put up for sale they would produce a handsome sum. In these circumstances, Lord Canterville, you will undoubtedly agree that I cannot allow them to be left in the hands of any member of the family. In addition to the fact that all this nonsense and playthings, however precious and needed they are to the dignity of the British aristocracy, would be out of place among people brought up on the severe principles, one might say, of republican simplicity. Perhaps I would venture to say that Virginia has a great interest in you leaving her the little chest that contains those jewels, in memory of the madness and misfortune of her ancestor. And since that little chest is very old and, consequently, very damaged, perhaps you will find it reasonable to accept his request favorably. As for me, I confess that I am greatly surprised to see one of my children show an interest in something from the Middle Ages, and the only explanation I can find is that Virginia was born in a suburb of London, shortly after Mrs. Otis from an excursion to Athens. Lord Canterville listened imperturbably to the worthy minister's speech, from time to time twirling his grey moustache to hide an involuntary smile. When Mr. Otis had finished, he cordially shook his hand and replied, "My dear friend, your charming little daughter has rendered a most important service to my unfortunate ancestor. My family and I are very grateful to him for his wonderful courage and for the cold blood that he has shown. The jewels belong to him, without a doubt, and I believe, on my faith, that if I were insensitive enough to take them off, the old scoundrel would come out of his grave after a fortnight to make my life hell. As for them being family jewels, they could not be until after being legally specified as such in a will, and the existence of these jewels was always unknown. I assure you they are as much mine as your butler's. When Miss Virginia is older, I suspect she will be delighted to have such pretty things to wear. Besides, Mr. Otis, you forget that you acquired the property and the ghost under inventory. So everything that belongs to the ghost belongs to you. Despite the evidence of activity that Simone has given for the broker, that does not mean he is no less dead, from a legal point of view, and his purchase makes you the owner of what belonged to him." Mr. Otis was greatly troubled by Lord Canterville's refusal, and begged him to reflect again on his decision, but the excellent pair held firm and finally convinced the minister to accept the ghost's gift. When, in the spring of 1890, the little Duchess of Cheshire was presented for the first time at the Queen's reception on the occasion of her marriage, her jewelry was the cause of general admiration. And Virginia was graced with the diadem, which is given as a reward to all sensible American girls, and she married her boyfriend as soon as he was old enough to marry her. They were both so nice and they loved each other in such a way that everyone loved that marriage, except the old Marquise of Dumbleton, who had been doing everything possible to catch the little Duke and marry him off to one of her 7 daughters. To achieve this, he gave at least 3 large, very expensive meals. Oddly, Mr. Otis had a great personal sympathy for the little Duke, but theoretically he was an enemy of titles and, in his own words, it was to be feared that, among the debilitating influences of a pleasure-seeking aristocracy, they might be forgotten by Virginia the true principles of republican simplicity. But no one paid any attention to his remarks, and as he walked up the aisle of St. George's Church in Hanover Square, his daughter on his arm, there was no prouder man in all England. After their honeymoon, the Duke and Duchess returned to Canterville Chase, and the day after their arrival, in the afternoon, they went for a walk in the lonely cemetery near the pine forest. At first he was very concerned about the inscription to be carved on Simon's gravestone, but they finally decided that they would simply put the old gentleman's initials and the verses written on the library window. The Duchess had some magnificent roses, which she scattered on the grave. After staying there a while, they passed the ruins of the cloister of the old abbey. The Duchess sat on a fallen pillar, while her husband, leaning at her feet and smoking a cigarette, gazed into her pretty eyes. Suddenly he threw away the cigarette and, taking her hand, said, "Virginia, a woman should not have secrets from her husband." "And I haven't, dear Cecil." "Yes you do," he replied, smiling. "You have never told me what happened while you were locked up with the ghost." "Nor have I told anyone," replied Virginia gravely. "I already know it, but you might as well tell me." "Cecil, please don't ask me. I can't really tell you." "Poor Simon. I owe you a lot." "Yeah, don't laugh, Cecil, I really owe him a lot. It made me see what life is, what death means and why love is stronger than death." The Duke rose to kiss his wife lovingly. "You can keep your secret as long as I have your heart," he said softly. "It was always yours. And you will tell our children one day, right?" Virginia blushed.